Chapter 17. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Matthew 25:21. Early in the spring of 1961, Mike began to talk of taking a trip to the East Coast. He had some business to attend to there, and he thought we might combine the business trip with our vacation. His sister, Doris, and her husband, Jack Gear, would go with us, and we would be driving. For some unknown reason, I was very reluctant to go and seemed to have a check from the Lord. Usually traveling was my great delight, and I was always ready for a trip. I could not understand this reluctance to go, but finally it became so strong that I told Mike one evening I didn't feel I wanted to take the trip. I had a distinct check in even thinking about going. I asked him if he would not consider just flying to the East, conducting his business, and flying home again. In that way, we could take our vacation in a place where we could have some rest instead of such strenuous traveling. He thought about it for a while, and he told me he would not insist that I go, but he felt so strongly he should go that he would go alone with his sister and her husband. I told him in that case, if he insisted on going on the trip, I should go too, even though I had this distinct check about going. I went to the Lord in prayer and told him that since I knew as Mike's wife I should submit my will to his, I would go. However, I was not happy about the matter and faced the trip with much apprehension. At this time, King's Garden was steadily growing. Each department was expanding in many different ways. Bowieville, which had just been given to King's Garden with money enough to start building, was ready for the work of taking in boys who needed a home. Workers had been moved to the farm to get it into production. A long-range program had been worked out regarding buildings for this farm. Many people had evidenced an interest in living in our rest home, but they desired to have a separate apartment to live in. For this reason, the King's Crest apartments with 24 units were being built. These were just in process of construction at the time we left for the East. The great need in the school was for an auditorium/gymnasium, and Mike had been thinking of how a building of this kind could be financed. It was still in the planning stage when Mike left, but he told me he thought he would start pressing towards beginning to build in the fall. This structure could serve a dual purpose and be used for large gatherings. He especially had in mind the missionary conference, which was held in the spring of each year. It was necessary to erect a tent each year to house the conference, and having a large auditorium would be a great advantage. Outside painting of all the buildings on the grounds had been started. Plans were being made to make the grounds more beautiful, with new lawns replacing the old worn-out ones, and new shrubs and flowers being planted. Mike was working towards stabilizing every phase of the work and revisiting the organizational setup. The apartment we had lived in when we first moved to King's Garden had been remodeled and made into an executive wing, with offices for Mike and his assistant, his brother, Vernon. The sitting room was turned into a place for the King's Garden board to hold their meetings. Mike had occupied his new office only 2 weeks before we left on our trip. We left on June 4th, and for the first week, we had a very enjoyable time. Then we reached Chicago, where we had rooms reserved for us at the Evangelical Alliance Mission. On Sunday morning, we went to Moody Church, and during the service, Mike sneezed several times. He often had attacks of hay fever, and we just laughed, thinking something in the church had caused his hay fever to come to the fore. However, by evening, it was apparent it was not hay fever, but a cold coming on. We got some medicine for him at the drugstore and went to Wheaton, where Mike had a service that evening. He said nothing, but I believe Mike was feeling quite ill after the service and insisted that we stay at Wheaton College all night instead of going back to our rooms at team headquarters. The next morning, the 3 of them went sightseeing while I stopped at a laundromat to do some needed washing. After lunch, we drove back to Chicago, and the 2 men went out to see Moody Press. Mike left his manuscript for the book I Live by Faith with them and asked if they would check to see if it was something that would be good to publish. Doris and I went shopping and later met with the men. Then we went to friends for dinner. The next morning, we were going to get an early start for Detroit. Mike was going to drive first. Before leaving Chicago, he drove into a gas station. While the attendant was filling the tank, Mike came to the car and told us, I have a severe pain in my chest, and perhaps before I leave town, I should see a doctor. So we drove back to team headquarters, obtained the name of a doctor, and drove over to his office. The doctor made arrangements for Mike to have laboratory tests that afternoon and told him to go to his room and rest, and until that time, he gave him some pills to help kill the pain. We went back to our room, and Mike had a good nap until noon. When he woke up, he said he felt normal once more and wanted to continue our trip. It was so terribly warm in Chicago, and he felt if we could reach Detroit, it might be cooler. The four of us knelt and prayed. We all received the same answer that we should continue on to Detroit before Mike received a complete checkup. Mike stood the trip very well, even eating a good meal in a restaurant that evening. We reached Detroit about 10 and immediately went to the home of the Fred Rennicks, former missionaries, where we were to stay. Mike undressed, got into bed, and told us he felt hungry. A bowl of hot soup was soon forthcoming, and he seemed to enjoy it a great deal. After eating, he leaned back and murmured, "That was good." Immediately, the pain came back again, and he was in agony in just a few seconds. Rennicks called a doctor who lived nearby, and by midnight, Mike was in the hospital. Because of the crowded conditions, it was necessary to keep him in the outpatient clinic overnight. I sat with him all night long, only leaving him long enough to call my children in Seattle. Doctors and nurses came and went all night long, ministering to him. I was told he had suffered a major heart attack, complicated by pneumonia. In the morning, he was moved into a room and seemed to be brighter. He began to make gains in a real fight for his life. I knew much prayer was going up to the throne of grace on his behalf, and I was confident he was going to get well. I stayed with him at the hospital during the day, going back to the Rennicks to sleep. He was able to talk with me for a few minutes at a time, and then he would sleep for a while. He mentioned several times how thankful he was that we had gone on to Detroit because the weather was so much cooler. Sunday morning, when I reached the hospital, Mike began to tell me of a dream he had the night before. He had gone to heaven, but it was not a bit as he thought it was. It was composed of different stations for different groups of people. The higher stations were for those who were the more yielded Christians. Mike and I had often talked of what heaven was like, and we had come to the conclusion the New Jerusalem must be a mountain, for the Bible says it is 1,500 miles high and has one street of gold. We thought perhaps the street would round and round until it reached the bottom of the mountain. As he told me of his dream, I laughingly said, "I suppose you went to the foot of the mountain." He looked so bashful for a minute and then nodded his head and said nothing. I went on, "The Lord came and took you up higher, didn't he?" He said softly, "That was just what happened." He paused as if reluctant to appear to be bragging, and then said, "He took me up quite a ways. I think I now know what heaven is like." I wanted to talk more to him about the matter, but the doctor had said he must keep his mind fixed on the fact that he wanted to get well. I was afraid that if his mind dwelt too much on heaven, he would lose his desire to live. For that reason, I changed the subject and began to talk to him about how much we needed him, and he must do all he could to get well once more. Since he was making progress, Jack and Doris Gear decided to take the car and travel on. Jack would attempt to conduct the business for Mike. By Tuesday morning, Mike was so much better that he was taken out of the oxygen tent and his pneumonia jacket came off. He was told he could have a shave, so I called in a barber. He wanted me to comb his hair, and he insisted that it be parted just right. The man in the next bed laughed and told Mike he was giving me an impossible task when he had so little hair. He was so relaxed and happy that day, and we had a good time talking together about what we were going to do in the future. Once he said, "The Lord seems to have set the stage for something, and I don't know just what it is." I leaned over his bed and said, "Do you see now why I didn't want to take this trip?" A wide grin was his only answer. Towards evening, he began to be weary, so I told him I would go down to the cafeteria for a cup of coffee and then go on home. After drinking my coffee, I went back to his room, but he was sound asleep. I did not bother him, but just took my purse and left. The next morning, Mr. Rennicks awakened me at 6 a.m. and told me Mike had gone to be with the Lord. As far as the nurse could ascertain, he slipped away in his sleep. My mind could not seem to comprehend this news because he had been doing so well. As I stood in my room at the Rennicks, bewildered and shocked, The Lord spoke so definitely, "Can you praise me even now?" I had to be honest and say, "No, Lord, I can't praise you for this." It took a few days before I could thank the Lord for taking Mike from me. I called Seattle and told them the sad news. The children asked that I come home immediately. There was a plane at 10 a.m., and we had quite a race in order for me to get to the airport in time. Before I could go, it was necessary to make arrangements for a funeral home to take charge of Mike's body, and we hurried to get everything done. I am indeed indebted to the Rennicks for their kindness to me in my time of need. When I reached Chicago, I found that the plane for Seattle was delayed, and I would have a 3-hour wait. As I turned away from the counter after receiving this information, I really felt God had deserted me. How could I fill 3 hours when I was so numb with pain? I still had not shed any tears, but this long wait was almost more than I could bear. Realizing I had eaten nothing that morning, I went to the lounge lunch counter and had a bowl of soup and some coffee. I came back to the waiting room and reasoned with myself this way. I would sit on a bench for 10 minutes, then I would get up and walk for 10 minutes, then repeat the process over and over. Perhaps in that way, time would pass. I got up to start walking and saw my youngest son coming towards me. I was so bewildered at seeing him, I was dazed. We grabbed each other and both of us began to cry. Oblivious to those around us, we wept our way to composure once more. Then we began to compare notes on how he happened to be in the Chicago airport. He had received the message of his father's death while at a conference in Minneapolis. He was told which plane I was on, and he decided to attempt to reach me in Chicago. His incoming plane from Minneapolis landed on the other side of Chicago. To get to me involved a ride in a helicopter over the city. Now he was there to comfort me in my time of need, and I felt ashamed of myself for feeling God had deserted me. He knew of my need and had arranged a few miracles so that Michael could meet me and be with me for the rest of the journey. Mike's funeral was held in the First Presbyterian Church in Seattle to accommodate all who wished to come for the memorial service. Reverend Melvin Dahlstrom, who had been our pastor some years before, gave the message. Hilding Halverson sang 2 songs that had meant so much in Mike's life, God is Waiting and I Have Decided to Follow Jesus. Bob and Elizabeth Staley sang Blessed Assurance, which had for years been Mike's testimony. It was a sweet service, and my heart was completely at peace. I did not even feel like weeping, for I knew Mike was at home with the Lord whom he loved so much. If he had lived, he might have been an invalid, and I know how he would have hated that. Mike was always so full of life and interested in being with people. 2 weeks before we left on our trip, he talked with my oldest son, Curtis, and told him if anything happened to him, he wanted him to be the one to handle my affairs and watch out for me. It would almost seem that Mike had a premonition that he was soon to go to be with the Lord. In the spring, a cemetery manager had come to Mike and offered to give him 2 cemetery plots as a gift for both of us. Mike's response to this gift with something like this, I had hoped to be taken up in the rapture, but God never gives me anything which I cannot use, so I accept this gift gratefully. On Memorial Day, we went out with our youngest son and his wife to see the lots. They were located in such beautiful surroundings near a fountain, and as we stood gazing at them, Mike turned to our daughter-in-law. He said, Kathy, this is where I'm going to be. Will you put flowers on my grave? Only a few weeks later, his body was there, but Mike was at home with the Lord. When my 3 children and I began to compare notes, we were amazed when we realized all of the many things that had happened to indicate that Mike was unconsciously being prepared for his homecoming. My daughter and her family had endeavored to return to the field that spring and had been told definitely there were no reservations available on any boat until fall. If they had managed to find a boat that was leaving, they would have been on the ocean when Mike left us. Instead, all 3 of their children were together in Seattle, and only our foster daughter and her family needed to come from a distance. At the King's Garden board meeting held a month before we left on our trip, Mike began to speak of what would happen to me if he should die. At first, the members were rather jovial about Mike being concerned about dying, but when they saw he was very serious, They told him if he preceded me in death, they would see that I was cared for the rest of my life. They asked him to write into the minutes of the meeting just what he wanted. Later, Mike dictated to me what he wanted written into the meeting minutes, and he was very specific as to what he wanted for me in case he should die. A week after the funeral, I returned to our home and endeavored to get all of our things packed away. There were so many of Mike's papers to go through. Michael and Kathy came to stay with me during this time until I could make plans to move. One of the things that touched me deeply was a letter from Moody Press accepting the manuscript of Mike's book, I Live by Faith. The letter was written 2 days before Mike's death, without their knowing he was even ill. I felt the need to get away from the King's Garden and all the memories there. I especially missed Mike in the evenings, for it was then we would walk around the grounds, visiting with those we met. We would inspect any new project which was underway, and so often he would tell me how much he loved the garden. He marveled that God had chosen him to start such a large work. When Rod and Joyce asked me to return to New Guinea with them in October, I was glad to accept. The change was a great benefit, so this book has been written thousands of miles from home. I am grateful to God for the 35 years of married life which Mike and I enjoyed together. I knew his heart was weak and that he would probably go to heaven ahead of me. Mike often would say that we were more than husband and wife. We were friends as well. We could talk happily together on many topics for long periods of time. Though we are now separated, I know I will see Mike again. What a comfort this is in my present loneliness.